Where were we? I have still got my diaphragm here. I haven't put the settings lever back in place here yet, so I better do that while I think about it. The first thing I have to do is line up the hole in the plate, the brass moving ring, with the hole in the black plate here, so that I've got access for the screws. And here's my settings lever, and it only goes one way up. This lever's always at the bottom, so it's somewhere around there. And I just need to line the holes up. And I can see the holes are lined up right there. Sorry, the video camera's not keeping up with the focus. So one of my two shoulder screws that go in there, I'll get that in position. That's good. And it's mate, so I'll just support this on the edge of the wooden block. Nip that up. Don't over tighten those screws, they strip out quite easily, and then you end up having to use them as rivets instead of screws. So that's what I wanted to do, get that lever back in place. That's good. The mechanism plate. So we have the blade actuating ring. It only goes on in one position. There's a pin here on this surface, drops in to that gap there. I'm going to lubricate this with graphite powder, so I'm not having to put anything on there yet. This plate goes on here. It's got a little rivet on it just at this point, which locates into the mechanism plate, so you can't get that wrong. The small screws, I'll start with them, the short ones. 3 of these are short screws. Just run that down lightly. I haven't tightened these ones up. Wait till you've got them all in position before you tighten anything up, otherwise you'll inevitably find that you've pulled the plate slightly out of alignment, far enough that it's not possible to get the last screw in place. This is the longest screw. I'll run that down. So all the screws are in place now and I can tighten them up. Check that the blade actuating ring moves freely, and it does. Flip this over and I've got its lever from the top to put in place. So normally I lubricate this with a touch of molybdenum paste just through the pivot hole and through that slotted hole where it connects to the blade actuating ring. And you don't need much, you just leave a bit of a dirty mark with it, that's plenty. Put that into place, fit the retaining screw in place, lift that screw up, check that it moves freely, it does. Put the spring in place, check that the action's snappy, that all feels good. As you move that lever here, you'll see the blade actuating ring move. So that's all good. That's our mechanism plate assembled, and I just want to lubricate that lightly with some graphite powder. I've got some graphite powder loose here in this container. It always ends up spilling everywhere. You end up with some loose in your container. So I'm just going to pop a bit of graphite powder around that blade actuating ring and just work that backwards and forwards. Just knock off the excess there. And now to lubricate that. I have a retard gear train here. I normally lubricate that with graphite powder. Just get that down there in a heap where I can find some. Pick it up with my tweezers. Drop it in here amongst those gear teeth. I'll hold back the pallet lever at this end with my finger. Move the operating lever here with my finger, with tweezers. Just work that backwards and forwards a few times. And that's it. Now I've just got to blow the excess graphite powder away from this. So we don't want any loose graphite powder in there now. And then assemble this. Right, to put the shutter blades in place, I want to unhook this spring, pull that lever outwards into the blades open position, find my shutter blades and start stacking them in place. The shutter blades are all cleaned. The first blade is distinguished by the fact that it has an extra hole in it compared to the other blades. And this blade goes here, this first blade goes here. Start stacking the blades in. I know that some shutters, if you put the shutter blades in the wrong way round, you can end up with a shutter that is normally open, and when you release the shutter it closes briefly and then opens again. But I can't remember whether you can do that on one of these shutters or not, because I'm so conditioned to assembling it the correct way. Today's not the day for the experiment. Right, so they're all in place, and I can get the shutter case back over the top. The alignment of the shutter case is easy enough. You can see that there's a square hole here in the mechanism plate, and of course a square hole here. So you know that those two basically line up. The lever hangs over the front here, so I've got this hanging out over the side so that I don't disturb anything. Where's that hole gone? There it is, something like that. Just check that that's all in line. Looks good. And I've got 3 small screws that hold the case together. Just get the first one run down. I'm not doing those screws up tight until I've got everything in position and I'm happy that the blades are correctly positioned still. Just running them up. If a blade gets displaced while you're putting the case over the top, it could end up trapped between one of the pivot pins and the case, and so end up getting damaged. So it's important to take your time and check that everything's correctly placed, that nothing is jammed where it shouldn't be before you do the screws up tight. That'll do. Just flip this over, flip this lever. Right, see there, the shutter blade here, it didn't move. So one of those blades popped out of position while I was putting the case over. And if I'd tightened those screws up, I would have damaged the blade. Let's just have this case off and put things back where they should be. put those off. Blade number 1 had popped out there, so I need to start with that. That's easily done, just for the blades to be jarred out of position while you're getting the case over the top. So you need to be cautious when you're doing the screws up, otherwise you could end up damaging something. It doesn't happen very often. I don't think it's happened to me for some months, but it does happen every now and then. Right, so we'll start again. Check that's all centered up. Get my screws in. That should do. Let's try, see what happens this time. That's better. Right, I can hook the spring in place. Check that the blades open and close smoothly, and they do. So I can go around and tighten those 3 screws now. Come back, check the shutter again. That's good. Everything moves exactly as it should do. So our shutter blades are clean and shiny. They open and close snappily. Our aperture blades at the back, nice and clean, move freely. So that's all done. Now I need to put all the control gear on the front of the mechanism plate. Of course I need to clean it first. The first component to go back in is this flash contact. Now there's a tiny plastic insulator slug in here, and I want to see if I can recover it, because they're easily lost. It's very small. It's about 1 millimetre in length, perhaps a bit more, 1.5 millimetres possibly. It's probably about 0.5 millimetre in diameter. That's very important. It's also very small. I'll put that to one side. And having recovered that, I can put my flash contact in place. There's a loose brass contact underneath it that just fits loosely in there, and that helps create a good connection to the case. Now this is square in section, but normally it's somewhat damaged and split. So it's always fun trying to get the less than square peg down the square hole. That went smoothly that time. That was very good. Sometimes you have to poke and prod at it gently from all sides to get it to slide into position. I'll do up the single screw. That's our flash contact in place. Now I'll clean up the other components. Well, with the mechanism plate assembled into the case, we've got our flash contact, our fixed flash contact in place, so I can start putting the other components in. Now I've cleaned everything with just naphtha using cotton buds as before, and I'll start by putting the pallets in place there. And you can see as the pallet wheel moves, that pallet rattles backwards and forwards. Effectively that limits the rate at which that wheel can rotate. Now here's the wheel that drives the pallets and also opens the flash contact or closes the flash contact. It's got a little cam on the top here, and I'm just going to run some molybdenum paste around that front edge of the cam so that that'll move smoothly on the flash contact. That goes on here. And our flash contact can go on. Oh, I want my high speed spring first. This is the extra spring that comes into play to drive the top speed, which is nominally 1/500th of a second, but in practice you'd be very lucky to get 1/400th of a second out of this. And 1/300th of a second is probably a more realistic target these days for shutters that are nearly 70 years old. Now that's not sitting down properly, so something is not right there. Either that's not seated or that arm's bent. You find out which it is. I'll take that out and check that. That's an unusual fault. Let's just take that out. Check that this seats correctly. Yeah, that arm is bent. As I can see clearly now with that spring out the way, that is sitting flush. But that arm is sitting too high. Just bend it down. Probably wants to come down slightly more than that. I'll take that out and look at it. Now that condition would have existed prior to me taking the shutter apart, so it means that that was bent previously. I'm looking at the state of this to see what it's like. And we're in the picture only just. There's nothing particularly obvious about the shape of that part. Could be slightly off, I see. I need to make sure that it still moves freely on there. It does. We're back in the picture. We are. Let's get this thing seated correctly. Where's my high speed spring? Put that in place. Get my flash arm in position. And put its screw in there. That's better. That's sitting there correctly. So now that if I rotate that wheel, you'll see it work the flash lever. So if it comes around this way, it should make that flash contact here make. It does. So that's correct, that's working correctly. And that was an unusual problem to have. So this component, the latch, that needs to be assembled because it's in two pieces at the moment and it's held together by a spring. Now the spring's on the base of this and the end of the spring is here. This takes two pairs of tweezers to hold this and get everything in position, and it ain't easy. It goes there like that. I'm going to pick that up with a pair of tweezers to hold it together. Flip it over. It's trying to get away. Now this spring which is here, I've got to hook it round behind that post. It doesn't want to go. Let's try swapping my tweezers over so that I've got my finer pair ready to get to that spring. So this is rotating in my tweezers, the whole thing is shifting. Ah, now it's come apart. Got to put it back together again. The parts are quite slippery. Okay, I've managed to lift the tail of that spring over and hook it behind that post. So the piece is all one piece at the moment and ready to go into the shutter. What I want to do at this stage is put a white of molybdenum paste on the pointy end of it, was where it latches, and I can put this into the shutter. Drops down over that pin and I've got to get it in place without dislodging that top piece. That's good, that's in position. Now I've got to get my timing correct. It's something like that. Just pull that back. Now I'm one notch out. I've got to get my timing correct so that I've got that cam correctly timed. I'm one tooth out, I think. Right, so this lobe on this cam here, the flat side of that lobe, this arm should be free to move past it when this arm here is trapped behind this catch. So that's correctly positioned at the moment. Now I need to fit that spring that had whizzed over my shoulder when I was taking the shutter apart, so I'd better set to and find that. Well, after sweeping the room with this big magnet, I found that spring. I'm just checking to see if I found anything else interesting that I hadn't originally spotted. No, there's a few iron filings on there, nothing interesting at all. Apart from I did find a washer. So that was a bonus. But I've got my spring, that's the main thing. So that wasn't where I expected to find it. I had to sweep a few extra metres of carpet to find that. Bring this back into the picture, zoom in a bit. See if I can get this spring correctly positioned. I've got to pull some tension on this spring, so I've got to use a heavier pair of tweezers than my finest pair. So this piece, this arm moves along the side of the lobe of the cam. The lobe of the cam is pointing in this direction. This is free to move along the side of it. This arm here is trapped behind this latch. That's the catch that holds it closed. When you press the shutter release, it releases this, swings this out of the way, allows that to swing in, which rotates this, fires the flash, etc., and releases the shutter. So this spring needs to hook from the hole in the arm here to this post here, so it's a bit of a stretch. That went smoothly. That's sitting in correctly, so that's all armed at the moment, and I want to get the rest of the stuff on there. So that's sitting there ready to go pretty much. 2 brass standoffs go there and there. Our cover plate goes here. I have to get that hooked underneath the edge of the slot there. There's a slot in the case. I've got it hooked under there and over the posts. There's a post here and another post here, a pivot for that gear. And I've got that spring correctly positioned so that that pivot point post there holds the end of the spring. That this arm is sitting in here in this space, not trapped out here somewhere. That's all looking good. The plain screw goes at this end. At the other end, got to get their XM flash sync lever in position. The shoulder screw goes through that. This is hard to get to stay there while you're trying to position things. Get that lever to seat round the screw shoulder's tricky. Yeah, it's going to do it. Yep. And the spring I need to hook into position. So I've got to pull that spring around and tuck it behind that stud on the lever, on the green lever. There you go, that went smoothly enough. Now I can tighten that screw up and tighten the screw on at the other end. That's done. Okay. So, the B lever needs to go on next, and the B lever sits here, and the B lever is held in with a screw. It has a spring fixed around a groove in the screw. So I want to get that screw started. Get that spring tucked down inside the case, otherwise it'll give me grief. Get that screw run down. That looks good. Check that it's free to move. It is. I'll nip that screw up. Now one end of the screw has to hook behind the B lever right here, so I've got to pull that back into position. I'll try to do that with the point of my tweezers. No, that didn't work. See if I can lift that spring into position. Yeah, try again. Alright, it's coming off the screw head at this end. I'll see if I can push that back in place. Yeah, I was successful. So that lever's sprung loaded. But the other end of the spring, the one that's against the case, has to be lifted over and come to the inside of this arm here. So I've got to do that. Just got to get under that spring with my tweezers. Looks like everything else is always easier said than done. Get it over the top of that lever and then hooked onto the inside where there's a groove. So now this lever is sprung loaded and the arm is sprung loaded and the spring is sitting correctly around the head of the screw, and the screw is tight and everything moves smoothly. Now I want my shutter release. This has a weird shaped spring on it that has to tuck down inside the edge of the case next to that green lever. So you've got to feed it in at a bit of an angle to get it in there and get the lever over its post, and that spring stays tucked down inside the case at that point. So there we go. You can't move that shutter release lever because the shutter's not cocked. If I swing, I'll hold that B lever back so you can see what I'm doing. This tab here cocks the flash sync mechanism. So I'm just going to swing that across like that, and that dropped into place and it's all cocked. It's just a bit of fluff there from a cotton, little thread of cotton, I would say. Okay, so now that was cocked. If you press the shutter release, it'll bear on this lever here. That lever will allow that arm to swing underneath, which will drive because it's got the spring on it, that'll be pulled forward. That will drive the wheel, which will move the flash contact and everything else. Like that. And that would have released the shutter. But the shutter itself is driven from the main lever, this piece here.